Okay, welcome to the second lecture for art appreciation. This one's called The Themes of Art. So we're going to talk about basically the types of ideas that the artist want to communicate. So first we'll look at the representation of the world, the power of the imagination, the idea of the beautiful, and in the critical process, that's the last slide like I had done in the first lecture. It'll be thinking about the themes of art. So I'll give you a couple of pictures and we'll compare them and see what we can get out of them and see if we can understand what happened in the lecture. So this is Claude Monet. It's the Regatta Argenteuil. And as you can see, it's from the 19th century. And he's using very, very big paint strokes in this one. But this style came to be called Impressionism. And originally it was because a critic had seen one of these paintings at a show and thought that it's not finished, it's merely an impression. But Monet really liked that because his idea was when you go out to paint, you should see it paint what's before you. So he's one of the first artists to actually go outside if he was painting a scene that was outside and actually paint on the canvas while he was outside. But his idea with his art in general was to capture things that happen with light and with shadows that hadn't been captured in paintings before. So how you would do this is he would, instead of thinking, I'm going to paint a sail and a sailboat and a sailor on the sailboat and a house here, instead he would think, I'm going to put some orange paint here, some red paint there, some white paint there. And after a while, the picture would be constructed. So his idea was that when people had been making art before, they weren't really making realistic art per se. It looked realistic. But what he wanted to do was basically just copy what he saw before him. So the theme of this type of art is the nature of art, the nature of portraying pictures. So this communicates some of the ideas that we'll talk about throughout this lecture, the artist versus the world. We talked about how Monet, he liked to go outside and actually be in front of the scenes he was painting. Instead of thinking of painting the subject, he thought about painting colors and lines. And when they say transcendence of the everyday world, that means instead of some artists, instead of just portraying what they see before them, like Monet does, they want to transform what they see before them and transcend it. So kind of rise above it. But also this particular painting is portraying the idea of the beauty in the everyday. So in this particular area, it's a regatta, so it's kind of a special event, but it's still something that's beautiful. And I think a lot of people can appreciate the beauty in the everyday now that we have phones where we can carry everything around with us, a camera around with us, and we can take pictures of anything that we see and see some of the beauty in the everyday. So the representation of the world. This is Thomas Cole, who's an American artist. And in this one, he's portraying, I should say right off the bat, he's portraying a very Western point of view of what civilization is. And it doesn't necessarily apply to the way that other people think of civilization. And civilization itself is kind of a loaded word. Westerners tend to think that their societies are civilized and other societies aren't. So this series of paintings was called The Course of Empire. And basically what he did is he started in ancient human times, or what he perceived to be ancient human times, and then moved up through an empire and then in the fall of an empire. So he called this first one the savage state. And savage is like a very like white supremacist word in this particular context, because he's showing basically people who are dressed up in skins. They have shelters that are like teepees. So he's trying to basically say that the Native Americans were once savage. But, you know, sometimes when you look at him, this particular guy has like a beard. You could portray it as like everybody was in this state, but still the association with Native Americans makes it kind of white supremacist. So he's trying to, in one way, capture the real world. But the real world is never looking like this, and we'll kind of see why in the details. The idea of nature versus civilization, and some cultures have this idea. Other cultures portray it as like organized areas versus unorganized areas, but it's kind of a similar idea. So I'll go through these paintings and I'll come back to all of them and see if you can notice anything happening in the sky while we go. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So he sees the next kind of progression for humans as being, this one's called the Arcadian state. Most people call this type of scene a pastoral scene. And it's meant to recall, as you can see in the background, it's kind of a pre-urban ancient Greece, and maybe even like Stonehenge or something like that. And we can see that people are herding sheep, and it looks like a pretty good life. So for him, in a savage state, people had to hunt and gather for their food, so that wasn't as secure. Whereas when people started farming and practicing agriculture, it was a more kind of like stable and easy, I guess you could say, existence. That's not necessarily true, but I'm just giving like Thomas Cole's point of view. So you can see how the people are kind of dressed like ancient Greeks, and everything seems rather peaceful. Again, take a look at the sky. So this is Cole's ideal balance between civilization and nature. And then this one, the course of empire, is consummation of empire. And he's pretty clearly trying to show something that is like ancient Rome. So ancient Rome has a lot of aesthetics that are from ancient Greece, but a little bit more extreme, shall we say. So we can see all of these people that are packed together in all of these buildings. All of the trees and grass and natural areas and animals that were there before have all disappeared and been packed with people. So it's a very heavily concentrated urban area. And when he showed all of these paintings, he had this one in the center. So he may have been trying to say this is the course of empire that 19th century America or 19th century Europe is in. So then we see the last one, destruction. So if he's portraying the Roman Empire, he's kind of showing how the Roman Empire was destroyed. So we can see that one of the sculptures, which is a war sculpture, has had its head cut off, which is kind of symbolic that the leadership has been destroyed. We can see this like pretty chaotic war going on, and all of these people trying to kill everyone and perhaps capture people for raping them, I guess, in this case. So the idea with this is that once someone has this, when they take this much power, which usually means taking power over a bunch of other people, eventually it's going to fall, and some of the people outside of the empire are going to bring it down. And then the last one is desolation. And this was a very popular idea in the 19th century, that everything that humans do is ephemeral, meaning it's not going to last a very long time. And nature will eventually swallow it back up. So we can see that going on here, where all of the buildings that were there in the empire were swallowing up. So you can imagine in the future, the United States will be swallowed up sometime. The big cities in Africa and Asia will be swallowed up. So one thing to notice is if you go back to the paintings, you can see that this is in the evening, the moon is in the sky. And then this is in the afternoon. We have kind of a low sun. And then this one is smack dab in the middle of the day. You can tell because the shadows aren't long. Going in the wrong direction. This is in the morning. So not the early morning, because we'll get to that in a second. And then this is in the very early morning. So you can see how the sky has pink and orange colors. Now, when you look at the sky again, you can see that there's a storm in the states that Cole feels are less than ideal, or less organized. So in this one, we can see the storm kind of approaching, which symbolizes for him that humans don't have enough control over their environment. And then this one, it's not a stormy sky. There's some clouds. It's looking pretty nice. Um, it's not super sunny, but it's certainly not too cloudy. And then this one, everything is bright. And that helps to show the way that the empire is highly organized, not necessarily ideal in his opinion, but highly organized. And then we have another storm coming with the end of the empire. And then with the last thing, we're back to a kind of peaceful state with humans not in it. So this is something that a lot of artists grapple with, the idea of very organized areas versus wilderness type of areas, nature versus like civilization as they think it, cities versus the country. And a lot of artists prefer the country because they believe that it's a healthier way to be, which may or may not be true. But in the 19th century, with the advent of capitalism at the end of the 18th century, by the time that Claude Monet was painting this in 1873, capitalism had taken over all of Europe and much of the United States as well. And the cities were packed with people. People had lost their land. It's kind of a long story how, and started to pack in the cities and ended up working jobs where they worked very long hours for very little pay and were exploited by increasingly wealthy industrialists or capitalists. So Monet didn't like that so much because in Paris, he started to see it look like this. Like some of this is pretty cool technology like trains. And we can see people can get places a little bit faster, but he sees, I think you can see that this painting isn't quite as beautiful as the earlier ones. So one thing you could do with this is kind of compare this painting, the artist's house where he moved out to the country, versus Paris, La Pont de l'Europe. And you can compare them to Cole's Course of the Empire. So which one do you think this painting matches the most? Which one do you think of Cole's Course of Empire does this painting match the most? So if you're looking for something to do on an extra credit board, that would be a good idea. So in this one, this is Albrecht Dürer. And during the Renaissance, and for quite a while afterwards, artists didn't just make art in the way that we think of today, where artists are trying to express emotions or ideas. Artists also were very technical at this time. There was no photography in the 16th century. So if you wanted to have accurate portrayals that you could print later for putting in books and for distributing in other ways, you would have to have an artist to be able to portray things very accurately. But there, despite this being in some ways like purely technical, he's trying to portray this particular natural area, the large turf, in the most realistic way possible. It also kind of expresses an interesting idea in retrospect. We're looking at a painting from more than 500 years ago. And think about this scene. If we go to this same place, maybe this scene isn't even here anymore. Maybe there's a parking lot or a mall or something. So what it's portraying is something that in nature, which is transient. But the art, once you capture it, it lasts forever. So we can kind of think of that as being a similar theme with Cole's. We see that we have the empire, it's all built up, it's very organized, and then nature takes it over. Humans are transient, and so is nature. And then the other thing is science versus art. At this time, a lot of artists didn't really see a difference between science and art. They're portraying things realistically. That was the same way. But we'll kind of see as this class goes along that most artists nowadays don't think of it that way. They want to put something of their own inside of the art. So this is a portrait bust of a man from Rome. And this is another one that's kind of interesting because you've probably seen busts like this before. And the way that they're made is they have wax masks that are used to make an exact copy of the person's face before death, sometimes after. So it would be a death mask. And then they would cast this, which is basically an exact copy of you, in bronze. And then the Romans had this really interesting kind of device where you could take a bronze and then transfer it to marble. Um, Maybe if I can find a link, I'll put this in the description to show how it works. But anyway, the point is that if you were to go back to the first century BC in Rome and see this guy, this is exactly what he would look like. But obviously, he doesn't look this way anymore. If he wasn't cremated, you know, there might be something still left of him, but not much. But we see him exactly how he was when he was obviously an older man. So art can make things that are transient in nature, and people are included in nature, permanent. So the power of the imagination. And we'll start with Andy Warhol, an artist you may or may not like. And this is Chicken Noodle, his series from Campbell's Soup 1 in 1968. And it's kind of interesting because what he's doing is he's making pictures of things that are very common items. So even nowadays, this was made in 1968. All of you, if I covered the Campbells, you'd know what this is. You go to the grocery store, you're still going to see this exact same can, and it probably tastes almost the same. So he was kind of thinking, well, artists in the past, they used to make things like this or things like this. But the reality that he lives in now, the reality that most people are experiencing are things like going to the supermarket or at that time watching television. Nowadays, we'd say be on the internet using social media. So we wanted to portray the world the way it was. So he made these exact copies, and he was originally trained as an illustrator of these soup cans. I remember the first time I saw a piece like this, it was at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh when I was a kid. And it was a bunch of boxes, like the boxes that they come in. It's a supermarket that the stock people take the cans out of. But it was hand painted. And when you I tried to get really close to it to see that it was hand painted, and you could barely tell at all because he wanted to be precise as possible. But it's also kind of making, and Andy Warhol didn't like to talk about his art generally, so we don't know exactly what he thought about it. But in some ways, it is expressing this idea that the things that we see around us that we think of as nature, plants, the environment outside, has been replaced by commoditization. So even when you think of food, before the 20th century, things like this, like cans of soup, didn't exist. If you wanted to have some food, you could go to the store and you could get things from far away, but you had to make everything from scratch yourself. And now that kind of like natural reality that humans have been living in for thousands of years at this point have been commodified. And you can take like, I kind of doubt this chicken noodle soup tastes like one of your relatives' soups that someone might have made for you. But the idea is to take the things that were once handmade and they're commodified, and then they're sold back to you. So another kind of point that's interesting about this is that early humans, before the advent of farming, which is about 10,000 years ago for some parts of the world, how we got our food is we hunted and gathered, mostly gathered. So you would, whatever was around you, and you would know a lot about the plants that are around you and the animals that are around you, you would have to get it from there, and you have to follow people around. And then when we started farming, people were settled. But when people first started farming, a lot of people were farming. Like until the 20th century, about half the world was farmers because it took a lot more labor than farming nowadays. So people would be familiar with what it's like to grow food, to harvest it, what it's like to raise animals, what it's like to slaughter an animal. But now, in some ways, we've gone back to an earlier time where capitalism provides the products, and then we go and we graze in the supermarkets, just like the hunter gatherers. We don't have to. I'm sure some of you know how to grow your own food, but in some ways, it is returning to an earlier time. So some think that pieces like this, which are very, very realistic, and you recognize what it is right away, are a reaction to abstract expressionism. So that's in the next slide. So that's paintings like this that were popular. You've probably seen Jackson Pollock before. He started making pieces like this in the 40s. And there was art in Europe that was kind of similar to this, but not quite the same. And when you first look at it, you're probably thinking, wow, look, that's a lot of paint. And I don't necessarily see a picture. But a lot of the artists, and Jackson Pollock would be one of them. We'll look at some other artists a little bit later on, and Klein that we're looking at now. Their idea was to take paint and kind of express their feelings just through colors and lines. So one of the kind of upsides to that is that it was something new. It was something that people hadn't seen before. One of the downsides is that a lot of people looked at art like this and said, I mean, there's not really much there. I don't really get anything out of it because it's not a picture. And a lot of people, when I'm doing this kind of class in person, will say, well, why is this art? And that's a really good question, because some people don't believe it's art. So why is it art? And there became this idea, which is usually associated with men at the time, that artistic genius makes it possible for anything to be art. So we can kind of explore that idea as we come along. So it kind of makes sense that after this being popular, something like this would be popular, because this is more down the earth. This is something that everybody can say, I know what this is. You may or may not think it's art, but it's recognizable. So it's not as far away from how most people consider art to be, like with this one. So pieces like this, minimalism. This is Donald Judd, and I think he calls all of his pieces untitled. They're really cool to see in person, but they look kind of like something you would see at an IKEA. This one's at the Walker Art Center. He's got one at the Detroit Institute of Art, and sometimes it's the Toledo Museum of Art as well. So the piece is purposely devoid of emotion. And a lot of the minimalists said that kind of thing. In other words, they ask, what does it mean? And they say, well, it's a bunch of blue rectangles. Looks cool, right? It's a cool design. That's it. It was purposely devoid of emotion. So perhaps these kind of pieces were a reaction to abstract expressionism as well. So this sort of thing, some of you might find it appealing. This one you might say, well, that's not necessarily what I consider to be art, but a lot of people might find the organization or the color scheme to be very appealing. So it could be a reaction to abstract expressionism as well. In other words, they don't want to put feelings that people might not understand in the art. They just want to make things that look cool. So this is Jan van Eyck, who we looked at in the last lecture. We had a lot of that. And this piece is called God. It's from a bigger altar piece called the Ghent altar piece that has a lot of characters in it. As you can see, it's from the 15th century. This is kind of difficult because in Christian art, if you're not aware with Christianity, Christians believe there is a God, the Father, that's a kind of eternal God. And this is roughly equivalent to the God in Judaism and Islam, separate from the world and created everything and is all knowing. But Christians also believe that God made himself into a human being, which is Jesus, and that God has a presence in the everyday world, which is the Holy Spirit. But even given that, before the Renaissance or so, people didn't have an idea of portraying God the Father in Europe, because they thought of God the Father as not being a person, but being something that is immaterial. But in the Renaissance, people wanted to make everything look natural. So they started portraying images of God. You're probably familiar with the Michelangelo one with the gray beard and such. And this one is portraying God the Father. Again, this is not Jesus, but portraying him as a young man. So it's basically a way to take something that has no description, which is God the Father, no physical description, and trying to make it into something physical. And what Jan van Eyck did is make it into what looks like an elite person from that particular time period. So you can see that, God is a powerful figure. So you can kind of compare this to other images of God, and I'm going to show you another one. So on this, he has written in Latin, because that's what they did. This is God, all powerful in his divine majesty, of all the best by the gentleness of his goodness, the most liberal giver, because of his infinite generosity. So it's kind of interesting on this particular piece in the background. If I should have gotten a little bit closer to it, but in the background, there are pelicans. And a pelican is a symbol of God's mercy and love. If you've ever seen pelicans, like if you've been in the pier or something in Michigan, pelicans, whenever they feed their young, they kind of keep their young in front of them in a pouch. And then they kind of like eat the food and then puke it up to the young. But at this time during the Renaissance, people didn't know that. And what they thought they were doing is the pelicans were like poking at their heart and taking some blood and then giving it to their baby. So that would be a representation of what Jesus did, who Christians again believe is God, who sacrificed themselves and gave their blood and body as a sacrifice for everybody's sins. So Europeans at the time associated pelicans with God's mercy and love. So this one, accidentally skipped forward, is Pedro Perez, and it's his God. And he's taking a couple of things that are pretty common for religious imagery in Spanish countries and in Hispanic cultured countries. So like in Spain, in Mexico, and in Central America, these types of gilded crosses, the crosses are made out of wood, but it's gilded with gold, were very popular. So he's taking that style, but the way he portrays God is a little bit different than the way you might have seen before. So I don't know how you would describe it, but most people describe it as someone who looks like they got really high and put on some headphones. So maybe that's what Pedro Perez sees God as. Kind of cute, maybe looking like Arnold from that cartoon. I'm not sure. But again, you can almost portray the concept of God the Father as anything because it's subjective by necessity. There aren't any scriptures that describe God the Father as a physical form. So you need to have this sort of thing. You can just put in whatever you want. So to go with the idea that artists, not only can they take things that aren't described and create them according to their own whims, but they can also take things that are already there and make them their own and not necessarily portray them as they are. So this is Picasso's Gertrude Stein, which he did in 1906, which is right at the point when he was starting to get some attention as an artist. In fact, he got the attention of Gertrude Stein, which was really helpful. He was living in Paris at this time, and Stein is an American, was an American, she's not alive anymore. She was very wealthy and very well educated, and she knew a lot about art. And you can kind of see that the way she's sitting, even though this doesn't really look like her, she was a really big woman, and she kind of liked to take up space. And her voice, the way she talked, she liked to take up space, and she could because she was so knowledgeable about so many different things. And many people found her intimidating, but at the same time, she would give artists who were starting out, who were doing something new, avant-garde, something that's ahead of what people are into at the time, give them some money to be able to make some art and then maybe buy some of their pieces and then promote them through her writing. So she was a good person to know at this time, and Picasso hadn't quite made it yet, but he's starting to. So he invites her. He says, "I want to paint you." He says that to everyone, and he has her sit a few dozen times for the painting. He just has her keep coming back. He's like, "Oh, it's not finished. I didn't get it quite yet." And then after the, like, I don't know, 50th time or so, he erased the head and then left it and then painted it from memory later. And Picasso said about the painting, everyone says that she does not look like it, but that does not make any difference. She will. And I'm guessing most of you who are listening to this don't know who Gertrude Stein is. So for you, Picasso's prediction turned out to be correct. If you don't know what she looks like, to anyone that's listening to this now, this is what she looks like. Of course, you can Google it and see what she actually looks like. And what Picasso is kind of saying is something that artists will think a lot of the times, not in all of the art that we're going to study, but that subjectivity, meaning your point of view, is more real than reality. So for these types of artists, one of the purposes of art is to express their subjectivity, what's inside of you that people can't see in any other way. So Dali was a pretty good example of that sort of thing. This is the most famous painting, The Persistence of Memory, that you've probably seen before, which looks very strange. But he called his pictures dream photographs, among other things. This style of art was called surrealism, and Dali wasn't actually one of the first people to do it, and some of the surrealists didn't really like him so much. But his idea with dream photographs, which was kind of based on a view of Freud at that time, the early psychologist, and the idea that dreams are some kind of wish fulfillment or some kind of desire that is unfulfilled. So what he would do he would make this kind of background with the water and the cliffs and the beach. And this background was similar to where he was from back in Spain, but he's painting this in Paris at the time. And then if he had a dream, or he liked to take naps and then wake up and write down his dreams right away or try to portray them, he would try to just spit it out onto the canvas. So he wouldn't try to think of, what does this mean that I'm seeing a bunch of, in my vision, I'm seeing a bunch of melting clocks, or an ant coming out of a watch, or my face with these long eyelashes that's kind of like melting onto the beach. He didn't try to think about what it meant. He just tried to put it out there. So this, even though he portrays some realistic things from his home, the rest of it, what he tried to do is portray what's inside of him, purely inside of him, in the most photographic way possible, so he could share his interior state. So kind of, even though it looks real, in a way, it's pure subjectivity. Whereas other artists who do abstract things, where people would think of it as being pretty subjective, the artists themselves might not think that. So this is Robert Motherwell, and it's called Elegy to the Spanish Republic, number 34. He's making it in the 50s, but the Spanish Republic fell in the mid 1930s. If you're not aware of the history, Spain had a Republican government that kind of kicked out the monarchy. And in the 1930s, there was some oppositions to this Republican government. And Republican just means the type of government that the United States has. And some of the opposition was the old people that were loyal to the nobility and the king and the queen from before. Some of them were socialists and anarchists. And the anarchists actually took over an entire city and ran as a city according to anarcho-communism in Spain. And then other ones were fascists, led by Franco and supported by the Nazis in Germany. So eventually the Nazis used their influence and gave weapons and other things to Franco. The Soviet Union tried to give weapons to some of the communists, and everybody fought each other. And because the Nazis gave so much support to Franco, he won. and Spanish people saw it as the end of the Republic. When Motherwell was painting this in 1953, 54, Franco was still the head of the Spanish government, where he remained until the 70s. So Spain was fascist from the 1930s until the 1970s, when it finally fell. So his elegy to the Spanish Republic is that government that was more of a democratic government, and I'm including like the anarchists in this as well, they're also democratic, and kind of lamenting it. And you might see this and you're just like, this is kind of abstract, maybe it looks like a flag in the background, then there's this blackness. But for Motherwell, he said, I never think of my pictures as abstract. He thinks of this as just putting his feelings straight out, and that those feelings are real. And in the case of the Spanish Republic and the Civil War that ended with the fascists taking over, it is very real. And I think most people who went through it would be able to relate to this kind of like dark cloud erasing the Spanish public. So even when people are, when you see the art and you might think it's expressionist or something like this, a lot of times artists, especially more recently, will see feelings as no less concrete than buildings or trees or things like that. So the idea of the beautiful, this is Renoir and the Luncheon of the Boating Party. You can see it's from 1881. And this is an example of a genre painting. And we'll kind of talk about this a little bit later on when we get to art history, but a genre painting just means a painting of everyday life. Although in this case, this boating party is rich people, as you can tell by the top hats. But even these guys right here with the sleeveless white shirts, if they were working people, the shirts would not be that white. So this is people who can, kind of get wasted in the middle of the day, maybe ride in a boat, eat some grapes, and play with their toy dogs, which were really expensive at the time. And so basically what Renoir is showing is the good life of the French bourgeois at that time. So a lot of artists in the 19th century wanted to make things that were more real. And they didn't mean like it looks like something in reality, meaning it's a scene that you would actually see in real life. So a lot of paintings like from the Renaissance, like they might look really real, but I don't think you're going to see anything like this in real life, even though it looks very realistic. And even the lighting isn't very realistic. So a lot of the Impressionist artists, they wanted to show things that were just in front of them. And they thought those sort of things were fine. It didn't have to be about some historical event or some religious event. It could just be what's happening. So we call those genre paintings, but the Impressionists and artists later on made this a kind of high form of art. So even something simple, this is Manet and it's the asparagus. It's white asparagus, which nowadays is very expensive, very good. So even at the time, it was white asparagus is very expensive. So in the same way as this previous painting is showing the good life of some wealthy young people, this is also showing the good life of what you can get as a very expensive vegetable. But it's also beauty in the everyday, because if you can afford it, it's something you might see every day. So sometimes art is both functional and beautiful, and they exist in those ways equally. So Connie Kwei's work, and he's a coffin maker. He's one of the Teshi people who live in Ghana, Africa. Kwei's not alive anymore, but his sons and daughters are still alive, and they kept the business going. So if you have enough money, they have a website, you can check it out and maybe get yourself a coffin. So this is a coffin, orange in the shape of a cocoa pod. And you're probably wondering, why is this in the Fine Art Museum of San Francisco? Is there a dead body in there? There isn't. Connie Kwei would make sometimes copies of some of the coffins that he made for actual people to be buried in, so that collectors could buy it. So that's where he's getting a lot of money. So of course he's going to do that sort of thing. Polychrome wood just means colored wood. And what he would do with these pieces is basically people would ask, and by the way, in Ghana, not just amongst the Teshi people, But a lot of times funerals, even though they're obviously sad, because you're never going to see the person again, they're also kind of a celebration, because many of the peoples that live in Ghana and in other parts of West Africa believe in the afterlife. So in a way, this is a transition to a new life. And indeed, this idea of having a funeral that's like a celebration, everyone gets together and you mourn, and then you have a big party. This idea of celebration had made its way to the United States through people in the African diaspora, so people that were enslaved. And they kept practicing it in places, especially in the French areas. So in New Orleans, nowadays, they have this idea of having a big party with a funeral. And that kind of comes from West Africa. So this one's for a farmer. So it's cocoa pod. If you're a cocoa pod farmer, you're in pretty good shape. So you can afford something like this. And he would make things like a Mercedes Benz for a rich guy, one of those ones that are like a limousine type Mercedes Benz with all the curtains on it, and you would have a driver and everything, a whale for a fisherman. So it looks beautiful. It's really cool, but people are actually buried in these and they actually put them in the ground. So it's art and utility. It has a use, but it's also beautiful and expressive. So this is another example. I'm not even going to try to pronounce those people, but they live in the Caroline Islands, which is rather isolated. And they make a lot of kind of cool devices that are basically like kitchen implements. So things to help them out with cooking. And this thing's a coconut grater. I don't know how it's used because I've never grated a coconut. But that's what it was. It's like a useful object. Probably when people made it, they wanted to have some aesthetic purposes, meaning to look beautiful. But I think the people who are collecting it, who are outside, they just see it as a beautiful object. It's a useful item to the people of the Carolina Islands and may be beautiful as well. But to collectors, it's just something that looks very cool. And I think most people can kind of appreciate the beauty of the lines in this particular piece. So some pieces really have almost an exact balance between something that is aesthetic and something is useful. And then other pieces, they go really far into the aesthetic. And I would say that this particular kimono is really far into the aesthetic, meaning just pure beauty instead of usefulness. This one's from the Middle Edo period. Edo is just the old name for Tokyo. As you can see, it's brocaded silk. It's heinously expensive. These are still made today, and they're also heinously expensive. This particular one is in the Tokyo National Museum. And what it was used for was what's called the No theater. So the No theater is one of the many theater forms in Japan. The one that you may have heard of is kabuki, and that's kind of like everyday theater for everyone. So kabuki is kind of like going to the movies, where No theater is kind of elite. So think of as going to the opera or something like that. And it was very, very slow and studied. And it has very, very old traditional music. It's supposed to express like Zen ideas. And everybody's quiet in the audience, unlike kabuki when everyone's yelling and such. So it's a very controlled and aesthetic experience, but people are actually wearing these kimonos, but they have to keep them stiff so that you can see all the pictures on them. So it's very artificial, and the theater, even though it portrays stories and characters, that's kind of less important than the ideas and the aesthetics. This particular piece, all the actors in No theater at this time were men. So this is a female impersonator at the time. So very aesthetic. Aesthetic just means something that exists for the reasons of beauty versus functional. Sure, this is a kimono you could wear, but that's not really how it's used. It's more about expressing ideas and also expressing aesthetics. So some can kind of put all of these ideas together. So Gothic cathedrals, and this is a really great example, Sainte-Chapelle. These places were made, the original people who came up with the idea for these cathedrals, they wanted to make something that looked like the heavenly Jerusalem from the Christian Bible, the last book, which is called Revelation. And then the book, it's described as being full of jewels and light. So they wanted to make this exist in these medieval towns. So they tried to make as much glass as possible. So all of this glass is not supported. The only thing that's supporting these buildings are these. And when you see something like this in person, it just is a blast of light. So the idea with this is it is practical. Like if you want to make this building, if you don't have the engineering down, it's going to collapse. And the engineering was quite sophisticated at the time to make these kind of giant windows without a lot of support. But at the same time, it was made for aesthetic purposes, and it gives a surely emotional experience for the people at the time. And if you were to visit nowadays, I would guess that you would have an emotional experience as well. So sometimes people want to make these aesthetic items, but they have a particular purpose in mind. Like Sainte-Chapelle is a chapel. Most of the Gothic churches were churches. So you actually had to be able to make it so that you could have church services in them. And that was the idea with this, the Sydney Opera House. You want to be able to have theater shows in there, not just operas, but other types of theater shows. And the architect, I think his name is pronounced Jorn Utzon, he said, oh, what I should do is, this is in Sydney, Australia, I should do a symbol of all the corals that are outside of Sydney, since it's in the bay. And that's kind of what's beautiful, what people think of when they go to Australia. So he makes all these like kind of shell designs, and it looks super cool, and it is a symbol of the city. But the problem is that it looks good from the outside, and the inside, it doesn't work very well as an opera house. The first thing, if you're designing a theater, is you want to make it so that when people are standing on the stage, even if people on the stage aren't mic'd, everyone in the audience can hear it. And it has all kinds of problems along those lines. So this is one of those cases where it's supposed to be an opera house first and then a statement second. Jorn Utzon kind of did the statement and then forgot the purpose of it. So sometimes aesthetics will override function. Sometimes aesthetics can be not beautiful. So even if you're thinking of something that is aesthetic, I had said before that it's relating to beautiful things, but ugly can be beautiful in this case. So when you're thinking of beautiful things, also think of things like this. Or, if you're a fan of like heavy metal music or something like that, a lot of times it's beautiful, but ugly. So this is Grunewald, and this is Crucifixion from the Isenheim altarpiece. And the idea with this is beauty in the ugly. So this particular piece was made for a hospital. And you might think, why would you do that? Why would you have Jesus being tortured in the hospital? But the idea is that, remember, Christians believe that Jesus sacrificed his body for everybody's sins. So if you're in a hospital and you see the sacrifice, you could think of, oh, well, maybe through the sacrifice, Jesus can heal my sickness or something along those lines. And the reason why some artists would make it so graphic is because many people believed that by kind of meditating on the way that Jesus was tortured, that they can have a spiritual experience. They can truly appreciate what they believe to be a sacrifice of to save them. And they can also perhaps get an idea of what it's like to be able to have this happen to them and to have kind of spiritual transcendence through it. So really concentrating on the violence of it all for some Christians was a way to worship Jesus. If any of you have seen the Mel Gibson movie called The Passion of the Christ, he's kind of doing it in the same way. People thought that the torture was excessive, but it's coming from the same place as this painting. The idea by really getting into the details of what's called the Passion of the Christ, meaning the crucifixion, the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. that you can have a spiritual experience and also appreciate the sacrifice. Now, this is a piece where everything is portrayed exactly as you would see it, but it has a meaning that you might not recognize at first. So this is Philippe de Champagne. Usually these pieces are called still life, nature morte, it would be in French. But this particular still life is more than that. It's what's called a vanitas. And a vanitas is related to the way that Christians look at people are blowing off fireworks outside, so hopefully it doesn't get into the microphone. So I stopped the recording momentarily. So this vanitas is the idea is that humans are only on this earth for a very short period of time. Christians believe it is an afterlife, and if you do good things and avoid bad things, that you can go to heaven. But if you do too many bad things, you can go to hell. So vanitas is the idea is that everything that you have, whether it's riches or plenty, or partying, whatever you have on this life, is a vanity because it's all going to be gone. And if you're not good, you're going to have to pay for it in the afterlife. So all of these symbols express some of those ideas. A tulip, and at this time, it was probably the first market crash was on flowers. So maybe it's a symbol with that, but flowers in general are a symbol of something that blooms for a while. It looks very beautiful and then it's gone. So on the long scale, Christians believe that human life is like that. But flowers specifically are also kind of a luxury item at this time. You can kind of look up I think it would be called the tulip crash in the 17th century. So this is a very expensive luxury item. The skull is exactly what you think it is. It's a memento mori. That means a reminder of death. So it's a reminder that life is short and the afterlife is forever. And then, just in case you didn't get it, they have an hourglass that shows time is running out. So whenever you see those paintings where there's like a bunch of grapes and all this food and it looks like a great dinner, almost all of these are vanitas. They're saying, sure, all these things might be great in the short term, but think about the long term and maybe think less about luxuries and more about how you can be good. So this is Robert Mapplethorpe, and it's a self-portrait. And he's kind of using the same ideas because this particular picture he taken in 1988, he had been diagnosed with AIDS. And at that time, there was no treatment for AIDS that could save you. And he died the next year, but he already knew at this time when he took this picture that he was going to die very soon. So he's doing the same sort of thing. He has himself floating. He's wearing all black, and the way that he exposed it, his body disappears and we see his head floating. And his face is really thin. If you want, you can look up pictures of what he looked like when he was young, because he had wasting syndrome from being sick with AIDS. So his face almost looks like a skull. And then he's gripping the skull, very similar skull that we saw in the last one. So for this, Mapplethorpe is kind of expressing the same ideas. I lived in this world not a very long time, but I'm about to go, and that's the eternity. So Mapplethorpe loved these ideas, even before he was diagnosed, of life is short, you should have a pleasurable life. And in this piece, the parrot tulip, it was part of what he called the Y portfolio. So he had shows where he showed the Y portfolio, which was pictures of beautiful flowers, and then the X portfolio, which was pictures of naked men, sometimes naked men performing sexual acts. And they were all done in the same like beautiful black and white style as the Y portfolio. And when he was this is going to be shown later after his death in Cincinnati, they wanted to show the Y portfolio in the X portfolio. And this particular museum that was showing it was a public museum. And in Cincinnati, they had laws against indecency and obscenity in public. So some of the local politicians said they're breaking the law and tried to have the exhibit stopped. So they actually went to a court trial because some of the people at the museum could have gone to jail for this. And they had a jury trial, luckily. And what the lawyers for the defense for the museum argued is that it can't be obscenity because it's art. And if you want, you can look up the other pictures he has. You probably have to turn off the family filter to be able to see the X portfolio. But they were very, very explicit. But Mapplethorpe actually explained this whole series before while he was making it. He said, again, it's kind of a symbol of life being short. A flower is an old symbol of life is beautiful and short, just like we had seen here. And he saw the very explicit images, because he was gay, as life. He said sexuality is a beautiful thing. And I'm showing these beautiful men in this picture. And this is another symbol of life. It's not obscenity. So that's what the lawyers argued. And the jury said, yeah, this makes sense. It's art because it means something. So they basically said it can't be obscenity because it has a purpose other than just being obscene, however you define that. The purpose is to have a meaning and to say something about life. So Picasso is kind of working with the idea that things can be whatever the artist wants them to be. So in this one, it's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And he started out and he drew all the figures kind of similar to these ones. And over time, he changed them and kind of like warped them. He used to also have somewhat of a background to the picture, but as it progressed, as he was going through his drawings, he kind of eliminated the background. You can't really see what's there at all. So these figures are kind of just like sticking out in nowhere, and some of them have these very warped faces. The particular scene that he started with, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, literally means the ladies of Avignon. Avignon was the red light district. So these are all sex workers that work at a brothel. And what this would be if you were John and you went to a brothel, they would bring women out for you, and then you would pick who you wanted to be with. So that's what we wanted to portray at first. But for Picasso, and this is 1907, he's still not like super confident. He had some views of women that were that they were scary, that they could take the soul of men. He had a friend who had killed himself after a woman had broken up with him. And he started to have these like bad views that women were like, yes, beautiful and enticing, but they're also horrible to men. Needless to say, Picasso was a more than a bit of a misogynist. But so how do you portray that? When he first started showing these, it didn't really get to what he wanted to show. So when he started to change the faces based on African masks that he had collected, to him, they looked like something that was scary, or at least new. So this is the original drawing. You can see he originally had the Johns in here. The Johns are like medical students. Even at that time, medical students like couldn't do anything except go to school. So I guess they didn't have time for girlfriends and boyfriends. But eventually he eliminated all of that and just had the women. So let's take a look at a couple of pieces on the same subject, David and Goliath. And I'll kind of tell you the story of David and Goliath first so you can understand both of these pictures. And I'll go to the next picture when we get to that part of the story. So David and Goliath is a story from the Bible. Goliath was this giant it's kind of hard to translate it from the Bible how tall he was, but he was really big. So like Shaq size or something, like 7 feet tall. And he was this great warrior. And his army had actually surrounded the ancient Hebrews at this time. And the ancient Hebrews had no chance. They didn't have enough weapons. They didn't have enough training. They felt that they were going to be destroyed by this invading army. But their general said, "Our greatest champion, Goliath, if anyone can beat me in a one-on-one battle, then we won't attack you." So everybody's like trying to find the best warriors and get them armored up so that they can do something. But they're worried that everybody's just going to get killed because this guy is so huge and so tough and so good with weapons. And then David, who at the time was just like a musician that was working for the king, he says, "I'll volunteer." And he's just like a kid. He's like 13, 14 years old. And everyone's like, "I don't think that's a good idea. I think you're going to get killed a lot." And he just says, "No, I can do it." So they try to like armor him up. They think he's going to get killed, but he's volunteering. But so they try to armor up. He said, "I can't wear any of this stuff. I can't move in it." And they want to give him weapons and stuff. And he's like, "No, I just have my sling. That's good enough." So they meet and, the crowd splits and Goliath comes out and he's huge and massive. And he's got all these armor and he's got a spear or a sword, depending on how it's translated, and a big shield. And David picks a rock up off of the ground, takes his sling and slings the rock at Goliath and hits Goliath right in the middle of the head, like we see here, and kills him instantly. Then Goliath falls to the ground dead. David takes his sword or spear, depending on how you look at it, it's translated, and cuts off the head of Goliath so that he can bring it back to the Hebrews and show that the battle was won. And that's what we're seeing in Caravaggio's version right here. So what I'd like you to do, if you want to, if you're looking for something to do on the extra credit board, this would be perfect. So think about what we talked about in the lecture, how artists represent the world, the power of their imagination, the idea of the beautiful, and think about how each of these from the story of David and Goliath might relate to some of these themes. So hit the extra credit board if you like. This would be a good subject for it. Otherwise, that's the end of today's lecture.